Afternoon on the Bandung Conference. Welcome also to our listeners on Zoom. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague here at the Einstein Forum and also one of the co-conceivers of this workshop, Benjamin Zachariah.
Thanks very much. One of the advantages of being one of the late speakers, and especially the one who is assigned to wake you up after lunch, is that most of what people have wanted to say has already been said. And so what you can do now is you can throw away your paper and hope for the best. But on the other hand, did I say that was an advantage or a disadvantage? Anyway, it comes to the same thing. It's, I was going to say that the disadvantage is about the same thing, but I first started writing about the subject of Bandung, Indian diplomacy, and the Nehru era in the last years of the previous century. And the first books that came out of that were published in 2004 and 2005, respectively. So most of it, one would have thought, would be obsolete. But perhaps, fortunately for me, not all of it is. On the other hand, rather than read to you what I've written already, I thought a better way to do it would be to work backwards, which is to give you a sense of the primary sources, and to give you the primary sources through my framing, and to give you what might be, in some cases, not entirely settled readings of new documentation, which we've all seen many times, so isn't actually that new. Meanwhile, to tell a story which I started telling as follows. Anniversaries and traveling conferences, Brussels, Delhi, Bandung, Belgrade, and the road from the Third World to the Global South. Now, this reminds me of a little trip I took along the Neckar River, and somebody was driving the car and the GPS said, turn left, and it said very insistently, turn left. Had we turned left, we would have been in the river. Meanwhile, the Third World has grown up to become the Global South. The Bandung Conference is now 70 years old, and I wrote about it first before it was even 50. It has now acquired an indelible place in the histories and mythologies of postcolonial and decolonial thinking. And as we might have noticed from previous conferences and discussions, the postcolonial is too inflected with the Western, and the decolonial is apparently less Western. What that makes the term colonial, which is common to both, I hesitate to add, but we might propose a kind of Schrödinger's colonialism idea, which is that if you're not looking at colonialism or colonialism is not looking at you, you don't exist. So a crooked line, if it connects Brussels at the Congress of Oppressed Peoples and Nations, the brainchild of the German communist millionaire Willi Münzenberg with the Bandung Conference of 1955 via the Asian Relations Conference in Delhi in 1947, which you've heard about by now. Bandung might or might not be a predecessor of Belgrade, and the person who both at Belgrade and previously in Bandung itself refuses the celebration of both is one Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1961, he says at Belgrade, when he's been anointed as the founder of the non-aligned movement, he says, we must not overestimate our importance. In 1955, when the Bandung Conference is running, and we've already heard this morning from Andrea, he says, we don't want this to have any permanent institutions. So either all these things are happening so as not to happen, or something else is happening. The founding conference of the non-aligned movement in 1961 then doesn't account for the fact that there are two strong countervailing trends, which are the pan-Arabism of Colonel Nasser and the Pan-Africanism that starts to center on Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah, ably led by somebody else who was cited in the first talk by Philippe and Vera, George Padmore, the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist, and whose work was connected very strongly to an idea that the Black African world is not necessarily the same world as the North African world. Now, how do we bring this into a discussion, if you like, where a great number of conferences and a great number of acronyms have just been assimilated to the Bandung Spirit or brewed into it? Well, the first task then is that of disentanglement. We know that Bandung was planned by 5 powers called the Colombo powers at a conference which actually was also dealing with the question of regional economic development and also a plan to stop the remaining countries of the Sterling area, which is what the former British Empire had become, to not spend dollars and to buy from each other. So it was a kind of imperial preference scheme after the formal winding up of empire. And the powers that met at Colombo and then at Bogor did not necessarily always see eye to eye. There was this famous moment at Colombo where Nehru had allegedly said to Muhammad Ali, the Pakistani prime minister, that he was nothing but an American stooge. To which Ali had replied, perhaps unfairly, that Nehru was nothing better than a Russian stooge. To which Nehru allegedly said he would tear to pieces Muhammad Ali, and it was quickly clarified that he meant not his person, but his arguments. Invitations to Bandung were sent out selectively and diplomatically. The USSR had hinted that they wanted all their Central Asian republics to be invited, but Nehru had decided that regardless of the idea of a multinational state, the USSR should be taken as a whole and counted as a European country. Ethiopia, the Gold Coast, Liberia, and Sudan were invited. Libya and Egypt were considered Arab. Israel was not invited so as to avoid offending Arab states. The Palestinians, as we know already, were represented by al-Husseini, who managed to get accommodated in the Yemeni delegation. Now, I think I want to give you a kind of backward-looking sense of what you can read through. On the one hand, a contemporary account, and it's not going to be Richard Wright again. It's going to be someone else. I would suggest I give you the account, or part of the account, of Homer Jack, who later on became one of the founders of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. He was reporting from Bandung, but also from some of the documents that appear as the National Security Council briefings, now declassified. The first I would read to you was a prelude to the conference, written on 30th March 1955. All but one of 25 countries have accepted the bid to meet in Bandung. The provisional agenda carries 8 topics: promotion of world peace and cooperation, problems of lessening of international tensions, coexistence, progress in Indochina, racial discrimination and racial problems, problems of dependent people in colonial areas and trust territories, nuclear energy in war and peace. Of course, we know that they claimed that nobody had a nuclear program for war, and we know that at least in the Indian case, this was not entirely true. Sixth problem of economic development, ways and means of cooperation within the Asian-African region. Seventh, cultural cooperation. And the last, desirability of holding cultural festivals in participating countries on appropriate occasions. All of this we've heard something about as we go along. Now, this is the National Security Council assessment. Agenda reflects strong Indian influence. Also, although sponsors have professed desire to avoid controversy, such an agenda actually gravy train for communists. Commies can assume posture on side of angels time after time, express pious views, avoid aggressive appearance. B, tip-off to tone of conference may be given in Indonesian President Sukarno's opening address. Then they go on to tell you what the blocks are, and they're quite differentiated in talking about, on the one hand, the neutralist bloc. Incidentally, India and Nehru always claimed that he was not a neutralist. He said neutralism implies not being involved. We are very involved. We are non-aligned, which means we do not take an a priori position on one or the other side. There was a neutralist bloc. There were clearly aligned blocs, communists, and then they go on to say, lineup of others makes outlook for West not at all bad. 21 of 29 participants are strongly anti-communist. Of these, 12 are closely linked to West. Among those delegates are such experienced and eloquent advocates of cooperation with West as Romulo, Philippines, etc. And they list up to 9 Japanese, Lebanese, Iranian, Ceylonese, Pakistani, Iraqi, Thai, Turkish, and Philippine delegates. Further factor, they go on to say, favorable to West is possible development Sino-Indian rivalry. Now, this, of course, has to be telegraphable, hence getting rid of words. 1, Nehru not believed favorably disposed to domination of conference or show stealing by Chai-Coms, Chinese communists. Chinese will probably behave correctly, press claim to Formosa. Will find conference useful place to plant advanced justification for future Formosa action. Now, this was the preliminary assessment of the National Security Council on what was going to happen at Bandung. On the 26th and 27th of April, they have summaries of what they think happened. And I think I read to you yesterday evening the first point that they make. Most remarkable aspect of conference was effective role played by anti-communists. Example, closing communique made no mention of communist neutralist coexistence or 5 principles. Instead, that nations should practice tolerance and live together in peace. After long battle, colonialism, which conference sponsors expected to be common denominator at Bandung, was denounced in whatever form it may manifest itself. Language which covers present communist expansion as well as past Western history. It's curious that in their view, it was the present communist expansion which would count as colonialism, but not present Western history, only past Western history. And then it goes on to talk about how Zhou Enlai makes the most strong gains of all of the participants. Now, Homer Jack's account, which in many ways is the most clear reportage and much less concerned with imposing his own agenda and readings than a number of comparable accounts, certainly Richard writes. He simply quotes a lot of the passages, and he makes only a few assessments at the end, some of which I think are quite apt and are worth talking about. In a passage called The Meanings of Bandung, he then points out, first, no permanent organization or secretariat was established to implement the many proposals and decisions taken at Bandung. Were they mere wishes, or would they be reduced to practical action? Nehru, at the onset of the conference, told the press that he was not keen on establishing a permanent body, and the Colombo powers repeatedly said that Bandung was not conceived to form a new regional power bloc. This we've heard already. And here's a point that he makes very strongly and several times. Israel was not treated fairly by the conference as a whole. Except for Arab League hatred, Israel would have been invited to attend the conference as geographically an Asian country. Nehru and UNU, it is reported, would have preferred to have Israel present and to have had the Arab countries criticize her in her presence. Barring this, the Arab countries found emotional unity in denouncing Israel, led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, who came to Bandung for that purpose. While many delegates in plenary sessions and in private ones made speeches against Israel, it was left to the Grand Mufti at a press conference to say that, I quote, Israel is a poisonous dagger pointed to the hearts of the Arabs, and the Jews themselves have definite plans against the Arab countries, and do not deny that they desire to include in their state all the countries between the Nile and the Euphrates, end quote. No attempt was made publicly to counteract these and similar statements, although in closed session, Burma and India softened extreme resolutions put forth by the Arab countries. If, as many leaders of the conference said, the Asian African countries can settle their own problems and must do so, there was no creative effort made at Bandung to try and find some compromise solution for the Israel problem with some justice to both sides. He goes on later to say, while a good deal of talk was uttered about moral and spiritual values for peace, and while the name of Mahatma Gandhi was alluded to once or twice in open sessions, there was no indication that any group of delegations was urging for Asia and Africa a Gandhian way as such. But he does conclude somewhat against the tone of his very pragmatic reading so far. Bandung was at least 500 years in the making. Not by arms, but by moral persuasion nourished by the world's great religions, will this third force help keep the peace the world so desperately desires. Bandung somehow caught the world's imagination, and early its leaders were conscious that history was looking over their shoulder. But only time will tell if history will remember them. Bandung may just be the hinge of history. And so, before Bandung gets completely unhinged, we can point out that the hinge of history leads the way from the Bandung Conference to what we might now call the Bandung Spirit. I will now read you the National Security Action Memorandum number 331, secret, called the Bandung II Conference, which, as we heard already today, was called off just before it happened. It says, the President wishes to encourage sympathetic, non-aligned nations, willing to speak up against those who are blindly critical of the US position in Vietnam. One of the more imminent focal points of this effort should be to prevent the Algiers Chiefs of State Conference in late June from emerging as a platform for anti-US resolutions, especially those attacking our role in Vietnam. We certainly don't want 60 to 65 countries, including many of our friends, hitting us from the flank in this way. So it would be desirable for the appropriate agencies under the guidance of the Department of State to mount a substantial effort to A, encourage those attendees friendly to us to organize themselves to prevent ostensibly unanimous anti-US resolutions from passing, and B, to ensure that both our purposes and the likely efforts of hostile elements to use the conference to designate them are made widely known to those attending. Thought might be given to whether the President should follow this effort up with personal message to certain attending chiefs of state, asking them to assume leadership to this end. And it's copied to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the director of the United States Information Agency. What's curious here is obviously Bandung 2, which didn't happen, is clearly not part of the Bandung Spirit. It's clear that you can actually choreograph conferences for very interesting purposes. And it's quite clear that for all the rhetoric that we hear about how decolonial, postcolonial, or indeed anti-Western all this is, we could hardly be imagining this without a framing of the Cold War, rather than a framing of some mystic Asian allegiances or strategic or emotive Asian-African connection. And as those of us who have been studying countries like India reasonably well over the years, the prospect for an Indian acceptance of several African countries as equals doesn't take us very far. When we then go back from the historical documents to what we think we know about these conferences, we recognize that every conference and every acronym is, in retrospect, assimilable to Bandung if you want it to be. The Bandung Conference is the conference which boldly went where no conference has ever gone before. But where that was, they were not sure. And the hovering presences of not only explicit interferences from the two superpowers, but of blocs called the World Peace Council on the one hand, which was broadly speaking a Soviet front organization, or the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was broadly speaking a CIA-funded American front organization, come to the forefront in a number of ways. And a number of the conferences connected by the World Peace Council are now being claimed as part of the distillate that is the Bandung Spirit. Now, I want to say something quickly about front organizations, because I don't want to imply that everybody who ever engaged with a front organization was nothing but a stooge of the Americans or nothing but a stooge of the Russians. Because the World Peace Council didn't make a secret of the fact that it had some support from the Soviets, and a number of people joined in, and a number of groups joined in because they were convinced that peace was a good banner to be under. This does not imply that they were all pro-Soviet bloc, nor in the case of the Congress for Cultural Freedom did anybody really know what was going on till about 1969, where apart from a few people like the Indian socialist Minu Masani, and also the founder of the first pro-capitalist party in India, most people claimed they didn't know what was going on. Masani was very proud to acknowledge that he had not only known of the funding, but he had been the conduit of the funding, had himself benefited, and he believed this was a good thing. Why is this interesting? Because one of the lines that we can trace from Bandung to, shall we say, the breakdown of the plank of the implied Asian solidarity that was peace between India and China, can be traced very specifically, I think, to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And I'll put it like this. In a world of limited resources, when there's a great deal of funding available, not only for certain points of view, but for certain forms of organization, it is not enough to say that the people who had these points of view existed anyway, and therefore the amplification of these points of view would not necessarily have changed very much. Now, given that the trigger for the Sino-Indian dispute is a border conflict that dates from 1911, we might want to linger on that for a minute. Because as far as Zhou Enlai and Nehru are concerned, this is not a border to be disputed. Indeed, quite soon after Bandung and after various agreements about dual citizenship are made, China and Burma make peace on the borderline, which is apparently disputed with India. Now, I'll tell you in brief what this border dispute is about. It's on something called the McMahon Line. The McMahon Line is a line drawn by the British between India and Tibet. But Tibet at the time is nominally independent because the Central Powers collapsed. Central authority collapsed in China after the 1911 revolution. Tibet, which was nominally autonomous under the Qing dynasty, was now in a position to be considered independent, except that in the negotiations that followed, the Tibetan delegation didn't notice that in the course of the conference that drew the McMahon Line, every day the McMahon Line drifted steadily north until it was drawn. What did happen, though, was soon after the agreement was signed in, I think, 1912, the incoming Chinese governments all denounced the agreement. Now, why is this interesting? Because Zhou Enlai decides that he's happy to have this line in exchange for territory in another part of what is the British-Indian dividing line, the Durand Line in the northwest. And the famous story is that the line is drawn at a place which is inaccessible from the Indian side of the Himalayas. So the time that the Indians discover that there's a road from Tibet to Xinjiang in what is ostensibly Indian territory is after the road is built, because before that nobody noticed. So the deal that is offered, obviously, by Zhou Enlai is we swap round. You can have the northeastern borders you want. We've just made peace on that line with Burma. And you might as well give us that part because you don't need it and you don't know where it is. And this deal comes under attack in Parliament, initially defended by Nehru, who says, we're arguing about miles of snowy desert where nothing happens. There's no need not to just draw a line. And in the beginning, Zhou Enlai and Nehru are determined to draw a line, and this is where the Congress for Cultural Freedom comes in. And this is where the beginnings of a Hindu nationalist view of India comes in very strongly. The Indian nationalist view of India is of the sacred soil of the people and the nation as unified, and that any attempt to alter the sacred map of India, it's always a sacred map, is a defiling of what should be the nature of India. Now, this starts to get pushed not only by the Indian socialist parties, and if you remember, anybody who's not explicitly a pro-Soviet communist, however socialist they may be, can fly under the Congress for Cultural Freedom banner, And they start to stage provocations. They stencil a portrait of Chairman Mao on the wall of the Chinese embassy and the Chinese consulate in Bombay. And then they invite various people to come and throw eggs at it. They start to make provocative statements in Parliament, and certain members of the government are encouraged to take very radical positions. Now, there is something which has probably been confirmed by now, but is reasonably evident, I think, if you start looking at information on India in US archives, which is that almost everything that passes Nehru's desk finds its way to American intelligence quite soon. So they kind of know what's happening. The accusation is that M.O. Mathai, Nehru's secretary, who wrote a 2-volume autobiography, which we can probably discount by now, was passing the documents on. I can multiply the initiatives that happened, but to stage a series of provocations that eventually results in the breaking down of border negotiations, and then into what is politely called the Chinese incursion into India, and other people prefer to call a war, in 1962, can be told from this basis. Now, what's interesting about 1962 is, just as in 1956, there are twin crises which are semi-simultaneous, Hungary and Suez. In 1962, the China War and India is more or less happening in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the fact that these piggyback events kind of take some of the heat from the one to the other, or in fact create some level of misdirection, is also something that needs to be held in the background. But once the assumption of peace between China and India breaks down, this is the end of the ability of India to maintain what they are calling a non-aligned policy. And famously, as Bob Vitalis told us yesterday, when threatened by the Chinese, Nehru appeals to Kennedy for military support, which he then denies having done. And the Chinese withdraw, which the pro-American side says was because Nehru appealed to the Americans for help, but he had denied doing it, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a narrative which is connected to Bandung, and it is connected to the question of whether Bandung was the cementing of ties between India and China, and the 1962 war was the breakdown of ties between India and China. But as you can see, the only thing that was offered to the Chinese in Bandung was their first public platform to use as an aspect of their diplomacy. When we take this as a route into a Bandung conference, which is widely otherwise supposed to have achieved next to nothing, people didn't really want it to mean very much. Everybody made a feel-good factor out of it, and it lived on in a great many things after. With that in mind, then, although we may agree on the end point, which is the breakdown of the assumption of peace between India and China, it doesn't take us back to the beginning point, which is Bandung. And that brings me back to all the lines that we're trying to draw. As we can see, we can just as well draw a very strong anti-communist line from before, through, and after the Bandung Conference. We could, of course, draw the other line, which is equally plausible, because Muhammad Hatta and Nehru and Song Mei-ling, who was Chiang Kai-shek's wife's sister and the widow of Sun Yat-sen, were in Brussels as guests of the League Against Imperialism at the Conference of Oppressed Peoples and Nations, organized jointly by Willi Münzenberg and his old friend Birendranath Chattopadhyay, which no one can pronounce, which is why he's known to the German Communist Party as Comrade Chatto. You can draw that line, you can go a little further back, and you can talk about Baku and the setting up of communist training camps for Asian nationalists of various description. And none of these lines is entirely wrong. But none of these lines is actually adequate to telling a story of what is a series of diplomatic initiatives which weren't very clearly conceived and which nobody wanted really to find out. Now, again, we can go to the World Peace Councils and the suggestion that is being made now that somehow this was the popular manifestation of Bandung, although given that several of the conferences that the World Peace Council did were before Bandung, they didn't know that there were Bandung before Bandung, so they weren't really able to consciously exploit this perspective. And where we are is we have a kind of amorphous anti-colonial sentiment being expressed. We definitely have a set of maneuvers related to the Cold War, which everybody agrees are not things you can step out of. I wonder if we have then something that we can retrieve from all of this. And the Bandung Spirit seems to be that which we want to hold on to. But when we come to look back, rather than forward at Bandung, then we can, in terms of a teleology, see many of the things that could have led to where we are today. If we look at Bandung as the culmination point, then we can look back at many points which, depending on your predilection, you could point to as having led up to Bandung. If you look genealogically, in the sense of looking at branches that die out, you could also be looking at various forms of internationalism which are connected to various movements, to people, and then eventually to movements and then states. And once you get to states, the movement part of it gets muted. And I haven't got a conclusion, I'm afraid, because none of this material really lends itself to a conclusion, so I'll stop there because I'm out of time.
Thank you, Ben. It's a lot of food for thought. I wondered if we could start with two simple questions from our Zoom audience. Not simple questions, I think they're straightforward questions, I believe. They'll probably tell me I'm wrong. They look like they're questions of fact. So one questioner asks, does the Baghdad Pact of February 1955, later known as CENTO, come up at Bandung? And shall I give you the second question of fact too? Yeah. Okay, the second one is, April 1955, the month of the anti-imperial Bandung Conference, is also an important moment for the Chinese colonization of Taiwan. What life does the first Taiwan Strait crisis have at Bandung?
I mean, both of them are very present. So the backdrop of the Bandung negotiations is also the question of the new pacts that the United States is piloting right across Asia. And the idea that we could now have a conference that has an independent nature is not widely accepted. Everybody knows that various countries are differently aligned. So that's always present and part of the negotiations. That's also part of the polemic about whether the United States is still a colonial power or whether the new colonial power is now the Soviet Union, which has colonized its so-called allies in Europe and has also been a force for colonization in Asia and so on. Is the Soviet government also a successor of Russian imperialism and so on? As far as Taiwan is concerned, it's always clear that that the offering of this question to China of presence is very clear. So Zhou Enlai on April 19th, 1955, in a speech which is kind of supplementary because he's responding to some of the things said, he makes a long list of the things that he does not raise in Bandung. And, you know, by not raising them, he is in fact raising them. He says, we aren't coming here to talk about Taiwan. As far as the tension created solely by the United States in the area of Taiwan, we could have submitted for deliberation by the conference an item such as the proposal made by the Soviet Union for seeking a settlement through an international conference. The will of the Chinese people to liberate their own territory, Taiwan, and the coastal islands is a just one. It is entirely a matter of our internal affairs and the exercise of our sovereignty. Now, this is something they have been consistent with, and it is at least an anomaly that the tiny island of Taiwan then takes on the mantle of the whole of China until such time as Nixon rudely decides that Taiwan is no longer China. But the crisis there is quite widely discussed, and there is still the open question of the blowing up of a plane which was supposed to have the Chinese delegation on it, and the question of whether the Chinese delegation moved another aircraft and allowed the Taiwanese to blow up not only the plane, but a number of their own minor officials remains open. So yes, Taiwan is very present at Bandung.
Yes, Susan.
I have another factual question. Another factual question. You mentioned the efforts to U.S. efforts to prevent them from, denouncing the U.S. role in Vietnam. What was the U.S. role in Vietnam in 1955? I've forgotten.
This is, that was a quote from the prelude to what would have been the second Bandung Conference on the 10th anniversary in 65.
Okay.
In 55, of course, they were just off the back of Dien Bien Phu, and the Americans had more or less begun to take on the role of the French in Indochina. But it's a very interesting point in time because India was very much present in the peace negotiations to end the war in Indochina, but then India was excluded from the Geneva Conference, which divided Indochina into 4 states. So this is also something that is a very important presence there. Again, something that is worth mentioning is that because India is not seen to be a stooge of the Americans or a stooge of the Soviets, India has a disproportionately large role in the 50s as an intermediary. For instance, on the negotiation of the transfer of prisoners at the end of the Korean War. And they make the compromise that both sides will exchange prisoners, but no prisoner will be asked to return if they do not wish to. This solves the problem of the North Koreans who don't want to go back to North Korea. But this would have been a sticking point. What happens then is a number of American servicemen opt to stay in China, especially black servicemen, who decide that no matter how people want to spin it for them, life in a communist state is at least better than that which they would return to in the States. Unfortunately, this lasts only as far as 1965 and the beginnings of the Cultural Revolution, which is also a very anti-Western sentiment, which is then marshaled. And in many ways, the prototype of post-colonial ressentiment, which we now have, is the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So then they end up going home. And I saw a very interesting documentary where many of them come back to China in the late 80s and early 90s and try to find their old friends.
Yes, please.
Just a point of query. Nehru had resistance in the Indian establishment on the question of the deal with China. How about Chow En-lai? Was he also faced with similar resistance within the Chinese establishment, or was it a kind of consensual thing that broke down?
I think that it's quite, I mean, since I haven't read any of the Chinese documents, I depend either on Neville Maxwell or somebody called Anton Harder. And I don't know, has he published his book yet?
No, not yet.
Yeah, so it's an unpublished thesis. Yeah, exactly. So he does say that Chow En-lai is trying to meet Nehru halfway, if I'm not misremembering this. And of course, Neville Maxwell that many years ago said, reading between the lines, it's clear that Chow En-lai thinks he has a deal. And it discredits him to a certain extent, as it does with Nehru, that he doesn't have a deal.
So does it compromise Chow En-lai's position inside the Chinese establishment?
I can't tell you, because they never actually let on. The Chinese way of giving face is to never directly criticize. You know the formula, Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong, but they'll never tell you which 30 and which 70. Yeah.
Have we got more questions? Yes, Susan.
If nobody else does, it was a very rich and very detailed talk, but as someone, one of the few people here who knows so little about Bandung, I'm still trying to assimilate this into a remark that I think you made yesterday about the anti-communist. I wrote this down. Yeah, you know, what remained of the Bandung spirit was actually the anti-communist thrust. And somebody, I think you said, or I'm not sure that I got it exactly. I mean, one thing that would just help, and I'm realizing we should have put a list and a map up, which 29 countries, but you know, when you were dividing them into those who were neutral and those who were, yeah, okay, but just which ones were neutral, or considered by the U.S. to be genuinely non-aligned, which ones weren't? Can you just riff a little bit on the ways in which the anti-communism played a role coming out of it?
So I think that if you look at the spirit as opposed to the results of the conference, the spirit could be communist if you wanted it to be. It could be socialist in a variety of ways. It could be racial. The whole point of everybody saying, including Homer Jack at the end, well, you know, I have all these pragmatic things I'm telling you about, but then this has been 500 years in the making and so on. So there's already this kind of divergence between the conference and the so-called spirit, which could be anything you want. But the more specific question, there is actually a list, again, the National Security Council list, 25 invitees, accepted 24, Seoul no Central African Federation, 4 political categories, Communist China, North Vietnam, Neutralist Afghanistan, Burma, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Syria, Anti-Communist Egypt, Gold Coast, Jordan, Cambodia, Laos, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Yemen. Pro-Western, 12. Ceylon, Ethiopia, Iran, Iraq, Japan, Lebanon, Liberia, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, Vietnam, i.e. South Vietnam. So they have a clear list of that. Was that it? I think it was. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I showed them on my presentation. Oh, very good.
Carlos Franco.
I don't know if you want to step out of the role of the historian for a moment and indulge in wild counterfactual speculation. But so I understand that Bandung Part 2 never took place. So let's say you were in the position of power and you could pull off Bandung Part 2 next year. What would be the main topics and the main goals that you would put on the agenda in order to move forward whatever you think is worth moving forward within that realm?
I wouldn't invite any states. That would be a start. And I think one would invite selected representatives of particular movements and to give it a very specific political agenda. Now, given that this is not exactly the kind of negotiation platform that we think it is, then we basically turn it into a spirited rejoinder to people who want to talk about states and state blocks.
Rejoinder to BRICS.
It would probably be a rejoinder to a number of state-based initiatives which now claim to have somehow imbibed the Bandung spirit. I mean, BRICS would be one set of things where I think the dangerous part of a group of organizations claiming to be liberatory, whereas they contain within themselves several genocidal and a number of anti-democratic states, means that this kind of romanticization, which is, dare I say it, very decolonial and not a little post-colonial, is very, very dangerous. I think it sets us up to be this kind of, the hermetically sealed post-left circle of self-delusion.
Would you invite religions?
No.
The question was, would you invite religion? And the answer was?
No.
Still no. Yes.
So, I mean, if you explain what is happening in South Asia or other parts of the world, I mean, you often come back to this non-alignment. I mean, actually, this is what I do sometimes in my work, because we see that countries like India are becoming more important for the EU, but also for Germany. And then you need to explain, but why are they trying to bridge Russia and are kind of friendly with Iran and also with the West? So I think this is something where we can often relate to and also explain that, where I bring it a bit into the presence. What I also find interesting is if you go now to forums, especially which are not in the West or in transatlantic forums, there is often a discussion of the middle powers, which comes then back to Indonesia and to India. Also try maybe to bridge it back, because it's the Bandung Spirit. So, I mean, it's a good questions like how we can see today and maybe how it reflects today. And you also said if India was important not to be seen as a stooge, and this is maybe something which is now back in the discussion with the ceasefire agreement between Pakistan and India. We see it is very complicated to see where you're aligned and where not. And these alliances seem to be sometimes for outsiders not so easy to discover or to understand. I'm not sure if you can speak a bit more how you see it for nowadays. I mean, you tried it already with...
I mean, I think it's a really good question about what is essentially two questions. One is, how do you justify a line of political activity or foreign policy which seems at one level to be completely without principle and to be purely pragmatic. And so the Bandung Spirit is a good one to do, because the Bandung Spirit will cover more or less anything. And the other is, you can actually draw very strong Cold War genealogies to a number of things, or simply to great power habit. So, for instance, the idea that Brazil, both under Bolsonaro and under Lula, is an ally of Vladimir Putin. And both the Indian right and the Indian left thinks that it should be also an ally of Vladimir Putin, is a kind of leftover of Soviet foreign policy where various countries are willing to see Russia as the inheritor of the USSR, and Putin as the reincarnation of Comrade Stalin. So, I mean, that's one example.
Actually, in the case of Putin, it's not so much the person, it is the deep state loving the deep state. Indian defense, 60% of the equipments are still sourced by Russia. So this is unconfirmed, but apparently when the Ukraine war began, the present Prime Minister was under pressure and he was considering eventually moving out of Russia, and the Ministry of Defense said nothing doing, we don't have the resources to do that, at least for the foreseeable future. So there is that tension in India.
I mean, so that's also the divergence between the legitimation stream and the pragmatist stream, which is often not acknowledged. Yeah, I'll go with that.
We have another question from our Zoom audience. What is it specifically about Bandung that gives it myth-making potential versus other moments or events that were contenders for similar themes?
Bandung, in many ways, doesn't have a footprint. I mean, there isn't very much that actually happened. So you can make of it anything you want to.
Are there any further questions? Okay. We'll have a coffee break now, and we'll see you again at, where is it? 4:30. Let's thank Ben.
Thank you very much.